She was beaten, humiliated, and abandoned by her own husband. But when everything seemed lost, a millionaire from the past reappears. If you like love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel. We post videos like this every day, continuing. The clock showed 3:15 in the morning, when the sound of the cup shattered against the living room wall. The shards of white porcelain wedding gifts chosen so carefully 6 years earlier now lay scattered across the hardwood floor like small fragments of the life that Emily had built, and that was now crumbling before her eyes. The scream remained, trapped in her throat, a ball of anguish that couldn't overcome the barrier of fear that paralyzed her. Mark approached with heavy steps, his eyes bloodshot from alcohol and the rage that always seemed to consume him in the early hours. His face, once considered attractive for the serenity it emanated in public, was now contorted into a mask of fury that Emily knew all too well. His hand, large and heavy, grabbed her wrist with enough force to leave marks. Once again. "You think you can make a fool of me?" His voice came out as a venomous hiss as he squeezed her wrist even harder. "You think I don't know you've been talking with that divorced friend of yours about women's rights, about independence?" Emily smelled the whiskey on his breath, mixed with the expensive cologne he used to impress clients at the law firm where he was a partner. The same fragrance that once made her smile now caused nausea. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and she wore only cotton pajamas, faded blue flowers from so many washings, just as her own existence seemed to have faded over the years. It was at that moment, when his fingers squeezed her wrist even more, and she saw the sick gleam in his eyes, that something finally broke inside her. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was pure primitive instinct, the same that makes a cornered animal fight for survival. With a sudden movement, she pulled her arm, and for the first time in 6 years of marriage, she ran. She ran like she had never run before. Her bare feet hit the asphalt of the deserted street in the upscale neighborhood of Boston, where they lived. The night wind lashed her face, bringing with it a mix of shame and liberation. Mrs. Wilson, the neighbor from 302 who always greeted her with cordial smiles, was on her balcony smoking a hidden cigarette. Their eyes met for a moment, the desperation of one finding the silent commiseration of the other. But the neighbor just turned her face, pretending not to see the scene unfolding. Emily ran until her lungs burned, until her legs trembled, until sweat mixed with tears she hadn't even realized she was shedding. She only stopped when she reached the neighborhood park, sitting on a bench under a centuries-old tree that had witnessed as many stories as her own. There, trembling and breathless, she allowed herself to do something she hadn't done in years: truly cry. The following hours passed like a nebulous blur. She called Rachel, her only friend who had survived the progressive isolation that Mark imposed on their marriage. Rachel, who had also escaped an abusive relationship 3 years earlier, didn't ask questions. She simply picked Emily up at the park and took her to her small but welcoming apartment in Cambridge. When Emily finally returned home, it was already late afternoon the next day. Mark wasn't there, probably at the office, maintaining his facade of respectable lawyer and dedicated husband. On the living room table, next to the still uncollected cup shards, was a brown envelope. Inside it, divorce papers already signed by him and a note written in his impeccable handwriting. "You will never be loved again." The words, like sharp blades, penetrated deep into her already wounded soul. But something had changed. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by a determination she didn't know she possessed. With trembling hands, she began to collect the porcelain shards from the floor. Each fragment represented a piece of her life that would need to be rebuilt. In the days that followed, Emily moved like a sleepwalker between the formalities of divorce and the search for a new place to live. Rachel helped her find a small apartment in a simpler neighborhood, far from the condominium where she had lived her years of golden nightmare. Her secret savings, stored little by little over the years in an account that Mark was unaware of, would serve to start over. Her work as a history teacher at a private school became her refuge. Between the classroom walls, talking about ancient civilizations and their ruins, Emily found a purpose. There, before her students, she wasn't the woman who fled home in pajamas at dawn. She was Ms. Emily, respected for her knowledge of archaeology and historical heritage. It was during this rebuilding period that she began to frequent the architecture library at Boston University. The place had a particular smell, a mixture of old books, coffee, and possibilities that calmed her. Among the tall and silent shelves, Emily allowed herself to dream again, even if timidly. She spent hours researching the restoration of historical monuments, an interest she had always nurtured, but that Mark considered irrelevant for a married woman. The morning was particularly grey when she saw him again. Samuel Bennett. The name resurfaced in her memory like a distant echo from an education conference where both had presented 3 years earlier. She had spoken about American colonial ruins, he about modern restoration techniques. At the time, they had barely exchanged a few words of courtesy, and she was accompanied by Mark, who made sure to monopolize any attempt at professional conversation. Now, alone among the library shelves, Emily observed Samuel from the corner of her eye. He seemed different from what she remembered, or perhaps it was she who was different now. His grey hair at the temples conferred a dignity that matched his elegant but discreet bearing. He wore a casual blazer over a light shirt, and his eyes behind thin-framed glasses conveyed a depth that intrigued her. She tried to concentrate on the book in her hands, a treatise on 19th-century restoration techniques, but her attention kept being drawn to the male figure now approaching her table. Her heart raced, a conditioned reflex from years of fear, but there was something different in the way Samuel moved, unhurried, without imposition, as if respecting the space around him. "Professor Emily?" His voice was deep and soft, as she vaguely remembered from the conference. "Forgive me if I'm being intrusive, but I recognized you from your lecture on colonial ruins. Your analysis of the deterioration process of New England's Baroque churches was fascinating." She raised her eyes from the book, surprised not only that he remembered her, but mainly by the fact that he specifically recalled her research. On the rare occasions when someone recognized her from the conference, it was always as Dr. Mark's wife. Never for her own academic contribution. "Mr. Bennett," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nervousness consuming her. "What a pleasant surprise. Your lecture on modern restoration techniques was also very enlightening." A small smile appeared on his lips, but it wasn't the type of smile she had learned to fear, the one that preceded demands or veiled threats. It was a genuine smile, reaching his eyes and softening his features. "Please call me Samuel," he said, making a polite gesture toward the empty chair across from her. "May I sit? I noticed you're studying Viollet-le-Duc. I have some interesting observations about his restoration theories that might contribute to your research." Emily hesitated for a moment. Years of conditioning made her question the intentions of any man who approached. But there was something in the way Samuel maintained a respectful distance, how his eyes focused on the books on the table and not on her body, that made her nod slightly. "Of course," she replied, closing the book she was pretending to read. "Actually, I'm particularly interested in applying his principles in the American context, especially considering our specific climatic conditions." And so, between yellowed pages and century-old theories about preservation, a conversation began that flowed with a naturalness that Emily had forgotten was possible. Samuel spoke with passion about his restoration work, but he also knew how to listen, a skill she hadn't found for a long time in her interactions with men. As the morning progressed and the conversation deepened, Emily began to notice small details about him. The way he adjusted his glasses when he focused on a specific point, how his large but delicate hands handled the old books with reverence, how his voice took on a softer tone when he spoke about losses, be they architectural or personal. It was only when the library employee announced the closing time for lunch that they realized how much time had passed. Samuel seemed momentarily disconcerted, as if he too had lost track of time. "Professor Emily," he said, carefully storing his notes in a worn leather folder. "I know it might seem inappropriate, but I'd like to invite you to a lecture I'll be giving next week about the reintegration of abandoned spaces. I promise it will be purely professional." The last sentence was said with a tone of gentle understanding that made something inside her contract. It was as if he could read her unspoken fears, her apprehension of any male approach. And, paradoxically, it was exactly this perception that made her consider accepting the invitation. She began, surprised at herself for actually contemplating the possibility. When and where will the lecture be? Thursday at 7 p.m. at the Architecture Institute, he replied, taking a business card from his blazer pocket. Here's my professional contact. You don't need to confirm now. Think about it calmly. Emily took the card, feeling the textured paper between her fingers. Samuel Bennett, Executive Director. Bennett, Restorations, it said in elegant and discreet letters. Below, email addresses and business phone. Thank you for the invitation, she said, putting the card in her purse. I'll think about it. He nodded, respecting her hesitation. It was a pleasure to meet you again, Professor. Your perspective on historical preservation remains as insightful as I remembered. As she watched him walk away between the library shelves, Emily realized she was breathing more easily than when she had arrived that morning. The card in her purse weighed like a possibility, not necessarily romantic, but of something she had long lost, a genuine intellectual connection, a dialogue between equals. That night, in her small new apartment, still surrounded by half-open boxes from the recent move, Emily took Samuel's card again. Her fingers traced the embossed letters while her mind wandered through the conversation that morning. For the first time in a long time, the silence around her didn't seem suffocating. It was a different silence, not of isolation, but of possibilities. The week dragged with a peculiar slowness as Emily debated with herself about whether or not to attend Samuel's lecture. Each morning brought a new decision. Sometimes she was determined to go, convincing herself it was just a professional event. Other times, she swore she wouldn't set foot in the institute, terrified by the possibility of exposing herself too much, too soon. On Thursday, after her last class of the day, Emily found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror at school, facing her reflection with a mixture of determination and apprehension. At 35, her face still maintained delicate features that occasionally made her appear younger than she was, especially when she smiled, something that had become rare in recent years. Her brown hair, which Mark always insisted she keep long, was now cut at shoulder length, one of the first decisions she made after the divorce. You can do this, she murmured to her reflection, adjusting the navy blue blouse she had carefully chosen, professional but not too austere. It's just an academic lecture. The Architecture Institute was bustling when she arrived, 15 minutes before the scheduled time. Groups of students and professionals were chatting animatedly in the hall, creating a buzz that made her hesitate at the entrance. For a moment, she considered turning back, but then she spotted Samuel near the auditorium, talking with some event organizers. He noticed her almost immediately, and a discreet smile illuminated his face. Excusing himself from the group, he walked in her direction with that same calm cadence she had noticed in the library. Professor Emily, he greeted her, maintaining a respectful distance. I'm glad you came. I hope you enjoy the presentation. There was something in the way he spoke, without pressure, without declared expectations, that made her relax a little. I confess I'm curious to see how you apply the theories we discussed in practice. The auditorium began to fill, and Emily found a place in the third row. As the lights dimmed and Samuel took his place on stage, she realized she was genuinely interested in what he had to say, not just out of courtesy or fear, but out of true professional interest. The presentation began with images of mansions in ruins, structures that were once grandiose and were now deteriorated by time and abandonment. But it wasn't a presentation about decay. It was about rebirth. As Samuel explained the restoration processes, the photographs transformed. Cracked walls gained new life. Faded frescoes recovered their colors. Broken staircases again supported. Steps. Restoration is not just about fixing what's broken, Samuel's voice echoed through the auditorium. It's about understanding that each crack, each mark of time tells a story. Our job is not to erase these stories, but to give them a new chapter. Something in those words touched Emily deeply, her eyes fixed on a particular image, a restored, stained glass window that, even after the repair maintained subtle scars from its previous breaking. The light passing through the glass created unique patterns precisely because of these imperfections. After the lecture, while most attendees headed to a cocktail reception in the hall, Emily remained seated, absorbing the last images projected. She didn't notice Samuel approaching until he occupied the seat next to her. "Any specific thoughts about the presentation?" he asked softly. She hesitated for a moment before answering, "The stained glass, the one from the church in Newport." "Why did you decide to keep the restoration marks visible?" A gleam of approval appeared in his eyes. "Because some stories deserve to be remembered, not hidden. The marks don't diminish the beauty of the piece. On the contrary, they're part of what makes it unique." The silence that followed was laden with unspoken meanings. Emily felt her heart race, not out of fear this time, but from an emotion she couldn't name. "Would you like to get coffee?" Samuel asked suddenly. "I know a cafe nearby that serves extraordinary cheese bread. I promise it's a public and bustling place." The last phrase, said in a tone that mixed understanding and a hint of sadness, made Emily realize how much her body language must still demonstrate her constant fear. But there was something about Samuel, perhaps his patience, perhaps the way he talked about preserving stories even if painful, that made her want to try. "Yes," she replied, surprising herself. "I would like that." The cafe was exactly as he had described, well lit with several tables occupied even at that hour of the night. They chose a table near the window, from where they could see the street movement. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the environment, mixing with the welcoming buzz of conversations around. "So," Samuel began, after they had placed their orders, "what led you to specialize in colonial ruins?" The question was simple, professional, but something in the way he looked at her, with genuine interest, made Emily feel she could be honest. "I've always been fascinated by the stories that ruins tell," she replied, her fingers playing with the paper napkin. "Not just about grandeur and decline, but about resistance, about how some structures, even after being abandoned and hurt by time, still remain standing, keeping their stories." Samuel observed her for a moment before nodding slightly. "And sometimes they just need someone who knows how to listen to these stories, right?" The coffee arrived, and with it a conversation that flowed naturally between professional and personal topics. Samuel talked about his restoration company, about successful projects, and others that still challenged him. He briefly mentioned that he was a widower. His wife, Claire, had passed away 7 years earlier, but didn't delve into the subject. Emily, in turn, shared about her work as a teacher, about the passion she had for awakening in her students an interest in history and preservation. She didn't mention Mark or the recent divorce, but something in her way of talking about new beginnings must have revealed more than she intended. "You know," Samuel said as they finished their coffee, "we're starting a restoration project in the historical district, an old cultural center that was abandoned for decades. If you're interested, you could give us a consultation on the historical value of the building." The professional proposal was clear and respectful, but Emily felt her stomach knot. Working with Samuel would mean more meetings, more conversations, more possibilities of, "You don't need to answer now," he added quickly, noticing her hesitation. "It's just an idea, no pressure." Those 2 words, "no pressure," made something melt inside her. How long had it been since she felt free to simply consider a possibility without fear of the consequences? She began, taking a deep breath. "I would like to know more about the project. Perhaps we can discuss the details another time." Samuel's smile was soft, but his eyes shone in a way that made Emily's heart skip a beat. "Of course, whenever you feel comfortable." As they said goodbye at the cafe door, there were no attempts at physical contact, not even a handshake. Just a quiet good night, and the silent promise of more conversations about restoration, history, and perhaps about scars that can become part of beauty. In the taxi on the way home, Emily looked out the window at Boston's night streets. The city, with its old mansions and centuries-old stories, seemed different now. Or perhaps it was she who was beginning to see herself differently, not as an irremediably damaged structure, but as something that, like the stained glass in the Newport church, could find beauty even in its fractures. In her apartment before sleeping, she took her diary, a habit she had resumed after the divorce at her therapist's suggestion. She wrote about the lecture, about broken stained glass that still shines, about coffees in busy places, and about men who know how to respect silences. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid to put her thoughts on paper. That night she dreamed of mansions under restoration, of light passing through stained glass marked by time, and of the possibility that some stories, even the most painful ones, can have new chapters. When she woke up the next morning, something had subtly changed within her, like an old wall that under layers of peeling paint begins to reveal colors long forgotten. The days that followed, the lecture brought a different routine for Emily. Her mornings at school remained the same, but now there was something new. Professional messages exchanged with Samuel about the restoration project in the historic district. They began with formal emails, attached documents about the history of the mansion, old architectural plans that he found in dusty archives. A week after the coffee, she received a different message. It was a photograph of an architectural detail of the mansion, a set of 18th century tiles partially preserved in a forgotten corner of the inner courtyard. The caption simply said, "Some beauties hide in the most unlikely places. I thought of you when I found these today." Emily stared at the message on her phone for long minutes, sitting at her desk in the teacher's lounge. The comment was professional, appropriate, but there was something in the choice of words that made her heart race. "I thought of you." 3 words that shouldn't mean so much, but they did. It was Rachel, during a Sunday lunch, who first noticed the subtle change in Emily. "You're different," her friend said, observing her over her wineglass. They were sitting on the balcony of Rachel's apartment, overlooking the Charles River. Lighter somehow. Emily fiddled with her own glass, watching the burgundy liquid create small whirlpools. "I have a new consulting project," she replied, trying to sound casual. "About a mansion in the historic district." "Mm-hmm," Rachel murmured, unconvinced. "And does this project happen to have a first and last name?" The blush that rose to Emily's face was answer enough. She told her friend about Samuel, about the lecture, about the messages exchanged. Rachel listened attentively, her face alternating between concern and contained joy. "Em," she said finally, "you deserve this. You deserve to feel butterflies in your stomach again, deserve to exchange messages about old tiles with a man who clearly respects your space. But," she made a significant pause, "you also deserve to take it slow, at your own pace." "We're not—" Emily began to protest, but Rachel interrupted her with a knowing look. "Not yet. But there's something growing there, isn't there? Something that scares you and attracts you at the same time." That same night, Emily received another message from Samuel. It was an invitation to visit the mansion personally the next day. The archaeology team found some interesting artifacts during the initial cleaning. "I thought your expertise would be valuable. If you can and want to, of course." Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the response. "What time?" The next morning, Emily found herself standing before the imposing colonial mansion. The Boston sun beat on the peeling walls, revealing layers of history under the worn paint. Samuel was waiting for her at the gate, wearing a short-sleeved shirt and khaki pants, a more casual version of the executive she had met at the library. "Welcome to our little project," he said, his eyes shining with genuine enthusiasm. "Prepare to fall in love with this old lady mistreated by time." The tour of the mansion was a journey through the centuries. Samuel guided her through the vast rooms, explaining the restoration plans, occasionally stopping to show architectural details that had survived the abandonment. His passion for the work was contagious, and Emily found herself sharing his enthusiasm, pointing out historical elements she recognized from her research. It was in the old ballroom, with its marble floor covered in dust and cobwebs, that something subtly changed between them. Samuel was explaining how they planned to restore the stucco ceiling when a sudden noise, probably a pigeon in some corner of the roof, made Emily take an involuntary step backward, almost tripping on a loose piece of the floor. Samuel's hands held her by the shoulders, preventing her fall. The touch, though brief and necessary, sent an electric current down her spine. For a moment they stayed like this, too close, breath suspended, the air heavy with unspoken possibilities. Samuel was the first to step away, giving her the space he knew she needed. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice hoarser than normal. "Reflex." "It's okay," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "Thank you." The moment passed, but something had changed. In the minutes that followed, as they continued the inspection of the mansion, there was a new tension in the air. Not unpleasant, but definitely present. It was as if that brief physical contact had made real something that previously existed only in glances and careful words. In the mansion's old library, they found the artifacts that the archaeology team had discovered. A set of old letters, some coins from the colonial period, and what caught Emily's attention the most, a diary belonging to one of the mansion's former residents. "It's from 1873, Samuel explained, watching as she carefully examined the yellowed pages. "It belonged to Mary Sanders, daughter of the merchant who built the house. From what we've been able to decipher so far, she fell in love with a clerk from a rival merchant family, a union her family considered inappropriate." Emily gently ran her fingers over the delicate handwriting on the pages of the diary. "What happened to them?" "We don't know yet," Samuel replied, his voice soft. "The last pages are too damaged, but—" He hesitated for a moment. "I like to think they found a way, that not all love stories have to end in tragedy." The look they exchanged then was loaded with meaning. Emily felt her heart beat faster, not out of fear this time, but from something different, something she had forgotten she could feel. "Samuel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "why did you choose me as a consultant for this project?" He didn't answer immediately. He walked to one of the library windows, where the afternoon light entered in golden beams through the broken shutters. When he turned to face her, his expression was serious. "Because you understand," he said finally, "not just about history and architecture, but about reconstruction, about how some things need to be broken before they can be truly restored." The words hit Emily like gentle but powerful waves. She realized she was trembling slightly, not from fear or anxiety, but from recognition, from seeing herself reflected in the eyes of someone who truly saw her. Sometimes she found herself saying, "I'm afraid that some broken things can't be fixed." Samuel took a step in her direction, but maintained a respectful distance. "It's not about fixing," he said softly. "It's about honoring the scars while building something new, like that stained glass in the Newport church, remember?" She nodded, unable to look away from his eyes. The air between them seemed charged, with static electricity, with unspoken words, with possibilities. The sound of footsteps in the corridor, probably some member of the restoration team, broke the moment. Emily took a step back, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "I should go," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I have classes to prepare for tomorrow." Samuel didn't try to stop her, didn't try to prolong the moment. He just nodded, understanding as always. "May I send you more details about the artifacts found? For your professional analysis, of course." "Of course," she replied, grateful for the return to the safe ground of professionalism. "I'll be happy to help." He accompanied her to the exit of the mansion in companionable silence. At the door, before they said goodbye, Emily stopped and turned to him. "Samuel," she said, gathering courage, "thank you for understanding." His smile was soft, but his eyes conveyed an intensity that made her catch her breath. "Always." In the taxi back home, Emily allowed the tears to finally fall, not of sadness or fear, but of an emotion she couldn't completely name. It was as if something inside her, something that had been frozen for so long, was slowly beginning to thaw. In her apartment that night, she opened her diary and wrote about abandoned mansions that keep love stories in their walls, about gentle hands that hold without restraining, about gazes that see beyond the cracks. And for the first time she allowed herself to write about the possibility that perhaps, just maybe, Mark had been wrong. Perhaps she could be loved again, not despite her scars, but with them. The following weeks brought a routine that gradually became familiar. Emily dedicated her mornings to classes at school, but her afternoons were now filled with regular visits to the mansion in the historic district. What began as a formal consultation was transforming into something deeper, not just her involvement with the restoration project, but also her connection with Samuel. They developed a silent ritual. She would arrive around 2 in the afternoon, when the sun began to soften, and would find Samuel always in the same place, sitting on the main staircase with plans and documents spread around him. He would look up from his work as soon as he heard her arrive, and his face would light up with that contained smile that she was beginning to long to see. It was during one of those afternoons, while they were examining the newly discovered Diaries of Mary Sanders, that Emily noticed something different in Samuel's behavior. He seemed more distant, worried about something he wasn't sharing. His hands, normally steady when handling the old documents, trembled slightly. "Has something happened?" she finally asked, when the silence between them became too heavy. Samuel took off his glasses and ran his hand over his face, a gesture that she had learned to recognize as a sign of restlessness. "I received some complicated information this morning," he said after a moment, "about an old company project." Emily waited, giving him the same space she always received when she needed time to process her own thoughts. "Have you heard of the New Life Foundation?" he asked finally, his eyes avoiding hers. The name hit Emily like a punch to the stomach. The New Life Foundation was the legal NGO that had assisted Mark during the divorce process, providing legal support that he used to try to discredit her. It was through them that he tried to prove she was emotionally unstable to keep any part of the couple's assets. "Yes," she replied, her voice coming out colder than she intended. "I know it well." Samuel finally looked at her, and there was pain in his eyes. Bennett Restorations was one of their main funders for years. I didn't know. Not until today. Apparently, it was a project started by my father before he passed away, and I simply maintained the funding without questioning the details much. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily felt the world spin slightly, as if the ground beneath her feet had become unstable. The connection she had felt with Samuel, the safety she was beginning to build, everything now seemed tainted by this revelation. "Why are you telling me this?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly. "Because," he hesitated, running, his hand through his graying hair in a gesture of frustration. "Because when I discovered today, I also found out they were involved in your divorce process, and I couldn't continue without you knowing." Emily abruptly stood up, from the chair where she was sitting, needing to create physical distance between them. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of contradictory emotions, anger, fear, disappointment, but also, surprisingly, a twinge of gratitude for his honesty. "Did you know?" she asked, her back turned to him, staring fixedly at one of the old windows. "When you approached me in the library, when you invited me to the project, did you know?" "No," Samuel's answer was immediate and firm. "I swear I didn't, Emily. If I had known, God, I would never have..." "Would never have what?" She turned to face him, years of pain and distrust overflowing in her voice. "Would never have approached me, would never have pretended to care." Samuel stood up too, but maintained the distance between them. His eyes, when they met hers, were full of an anguish that seemed to mirror her own. "Would never have allowed you to think, not even for a moment, that I could be involved with something that hurt you so much," he said softly. "And now that, I know I'll do everything in my power to correct this. I've already given orders to immediately end any involvement with the foundation, and I intend to initiate a complete audit of all the company's social projects." Emily felt hot tears running down her face, but she didn't care to hide them. "Why?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Why do you care so much?" Samuel's face softened, even as he maintained the distance he knew she needed at that moment. "Because you taught me something about restoration that goes beyond old buildings and broken stained glass. You showed me that sometimes, to truly rebuild something, we first need the courage to face the most painful truths." His words hit her like gentle waves against a wall she had built around her heart. Part of her wanted to run, to flee before she could be hurt again. But another part, a part that was growing stronger each day, wanted to stay and face this storm. "I need time," she said finally, her voice firmer, "to process all of this." "All the time you need," Samuel replied without hesitation. "The project, the consultation, everything can wait. Or it can be ended if you prefer. The choice is yours, Emily. It will always be yours." She nodded slightly, picking up her purse and preparing to leave. At the mansion door, she stopped and turned one last time. "Samuel," she called, her voice softer now, "thank you for telling me the truth." He just nodded, his eyes conveying more than words could express at that moment. On the way home, as the taxi wound through the old streets of Boston, Emily allowed her emotions to flow freely. She cried for the unexpected betrayal, for the pain of seeing the past resurface when she least expected it. But she also cried for something else, for the honesty of a man who chose to risk losing her rather than hide a painful truth. In her apartment that night, she couldn't sleep. She stood on the balcony, watching the city lights and thinking about how life had an ironic way of weaving its stories. The man who was slowly tearing down her walls of protection had, unknowingly, connections with the one who had built them in the first place. She picked up her phone several times, almost calling Rachel, needing to vent. But something stopped her. This was a decision she needed to make alone, a test not just of her ability to trust again, but of her own strength, to face the past without letting it determine her future. The next morning, after a practically sleepless night, Emily made a decision. She opened her laptop and began to research everything she could about the New Life Foundation and its connections to Bennett Restorations. If she was going to face her demons, she would do it with eyes wide open. What she discovered in the following hours surprised her. The foundation had a complex history of legitimate projects mixed with questionable cases. The funding from Bennett, initiated by Samuel's father, was just a small part of a much larger web of corporate and political relationships. And then she found something that made her heart stop for a moment. A leaked email from Mark to the foundation's board, dated a few months before the divorce, specifically requesting that his case be treated with special attention due to his political connections. The name of Samuel or Bennett Restorations didn't appear at any point in the correspondence. With trembling hands, Emily picked up her phone and typed a simple message. "Can we talk? At the mansion this afternoon." Samuel's response came almost immediately. "I'll be waiting." The afternoon was exceptionally hot when Emily arrived at the mansion. The heavy air carried the perfume of flowers from the abandoned garden, where wild jasmine had overtaken the old railings. Samuel was waiting for her in the usual place, but this time he was standing, his tense posture revealing the anxiety he was trying to hide. "You came," he said simply, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. Emily crossed the entrance hall, her steps echoing on the marble floor. She was wearing a simple navy blue dress, a conscious choice, different from the purposefully professional clothes she usually wore on her visits to the mansion. Today she wasn't a consultant coming to work, she was a woman facing her fears. "I spent the night researching," she began, her voice firm despite the internal turmoil. "About the foundation, about its projects, about everything." Samuel didn't move, giving her the space and time she needed to continue. The afternoon light came through the tall windows, creating dancing patterns on the floor between them. "I found an email," she continued, taking some printed sheets from her purse, "from Mark to the foundation's board. He manipulated everything from the beginning, used his connections, his power. Bennett Restorations was just another name on a list of sponsors that he used to boast about his influences." Samuel's hands closed into fists at his side, a rare display of emotion that didn't go unnoticed by Emily. "I should have been more careful," he said, his voice laden with regret. "I should have paid more attention to the projects we were funding, not just maintained my father's decisions without questioning." "Yes, you should have," Emily agreed, taking a few steps in his direction. "But do you know what else I discovered? In my research, I found out that in the last 5 years, since you effectively took control of the company, Bennett Restorations has funded more than 20 projects for shelter homes for women victims of domestic violence. Projects that don't appear in public reports, that aren't used for marketing or self-promotion. Samuel seemed momentarily surprised. How did you... I'm a history teacher, Samuel. I know how to research, how to connect dots, how to find stories. Hidden between the official lines, she took another step toward him. Why did you never mention these projects? He looked away, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture that she already knew so well. Because they're not projects to be mentioned. They're just what should be done. After Claire... He hesitated, and Emily realized it was the first time he had spoken of his deceased wife in a more personal way. After I lost her, I realized how many women are trapped in situations they can't escape from. Claire had all the support, all the love in the world, and yet the disease took her. But there are women who face their own types of diseases, toxic relationships, violence, fear, and survive. They deserve a chance to rebuild their lives. His words hit Emily like gentle waves, melting something that was still frozen in her heart. She covered the final distance between them, stopping just a few steps away from Samuel. When Mark left me that note saying I would never be loved again, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I believed him. I believed because he had spent years convincing me that I was too broken, too damaged to deserve love. And then you appeared with your gentle eyes and your words about restoration, about honoring scars while building something new. Emily, Samuel began, but she raised a hand asking for silence. Let me finish, please. When you told me about the foundation yesterday, my first instinct was to run. It was one more sign from the universe that I shouldn't trust, shouldn't open up, shouldn't... She took a deep breath, gathering courage. Shouldn't fall in love again. The word hung between them like a confession, like a prayer, like a challenge. Samuel's eyes widened slightly, a vulnerability he rarely demonstrated appearing on his face. But then, she continued, her voice firmer now, I realized something. I realized that the real test wasn't about your company's connection to my past. It was about how you chose to handle it. You could have hidden it, could have made excuses, could have manipulated the situation. But you chose to tell me the truth even knowing you might lose me because of it. I could never lie to you, Samuel said softly. Not after seeing how much damage lies have already caused in your life. Emily took the last step that separated them, standing close enough to feel the warmth emanating from him, to see the small amber tones in his brown eyes. Do you know what else I discovered in my research? She asked, her voice little more than a whisper. I discovered that sometimes we need to let the old structures completely collapse before we can build something new, something stronger, something true. Samuel's hand rose slowly, hesitantly, as if asking permission. When she didn't back away, his fingers gently touched her face, tracing a delicate line from her temple to her chin. You've taught me more about restoration than all my years in this work, he murmured, about how sometimes the healing process leaves marks that shouldn't be erased, but honored. Their first kiss wasn't like those in the romance novels Emily secretly read as a teenager. There was no thunder in the background, no swelling music, no fireworks. It was gentle, hesitant, like two people who know the weight of loss learning to trust again. The touch of Samuel's lips was soft, respectful, asking permission at every moment to continue. When they separated, Emily kept her eyes closed for a moment, letting the sensations settle in her memory. When she opened them, she found Samuel looking at her with a mixture of adoration and concern. That, he began, his voice hoarse, that was a beginning, she completed, a small smile appearing on her lips. A new chapter. The smile that illuminated Samuel's face was like the sun, rising after a long storm. His hands found hers, fingers intertwining naturally as if they had been made for this. A new chapter, he repeated, squeezing her fingers lightly, in a book we're writing together. The rest of the afternoon passed like a waking dream. They walked through the mansion, but this time they didn't talk about restoration or history. They talked about fears and hopes, about scars and healing, about how sometimes love arrives not as a hurricane that destroys everything, but as a gentle rain that makes flowers grow amid the ruins. When the sun began to set, painting the old walls with tones of gold and pink, Emily realized that something fundamental had changed within her. The fear was still there, probably would always be at some level, but now it was accompanied by something stronger. Hope. Hope that some stories can have new beginnings, that some hearts can be not just repaired, but transformed into something more beautiful precisely because of their fractures. The weeks that followed brought a new dynamic to Emily and Samuel's life. The mansion in the historic district continued to be their main meeting point, but now there was a different intimacy in the air, a soft electricity that permeated each interaction. The restoration work continued, but their conversations began to deepen, revealing layers of their stories that both had kept guarded for so long. On a particularly hot afternoon, while examining the newly restored diaries of Mary Sanders, Samuel finally told Emily about Claire. They were sitting in what had once been the mansion's library, the late afternoon light entering lazily through the partially restored windows. "She was a music teacher," he began, his soft voice carrying a mixture of love and pain that Emily knew all too well. "She taught at a public school in the suburbs. She believed music could change lives, and it did. Dozens of her students got scholarships to conservatories, some even made international careers." Emily observed Samuel's profile as he spoke, noticing how his eyes seemed to see something very distant. Her hand found his on the old table, a gesture of silent support. "When we discovered the cancer, she was at the height of a project to create a youth orchestra in the communities. Even during treatment, she didn't stop. She said music was her way of fighting." He paused, his fingers gently squeezing Emily's. "In the last months, when she was too weak to leave home, her students would come here. They transformed our living room into an improvised concert hall. The last smile I saw on her face was during one of those performances." "She seems to have been an extraordinary woman," Emily said softly. "She was," Samuel agreed, a small smile appearing on his lips. "You know what she told me a few days before she left? She said her biggest concern wasn't dying, but that I would close myself off to life after she was gone. Promise you'll keep your heart open," she asked. "Promise you'll keep finding beauty in broken things." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes, not just for Claire's story, but for the courage this man had shown in keeping his promise, in continuing to believe in love even after such a profound loss. "And you kept the promise," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "I tried," he replied, turning to face her completely. "But it was only when I met you that I really understood what she meant, about finding beauty in broken things." The kiss that followed was different from the others they had shared until then. There was a gentle urgency, a need for connection, that went beyond the physical. It was as if their wounded souls were finally finding healing in each other, but life has a peculiar way of testing the truths we build. The next morning, Emily received a message that made her blood freeze. It was from an unknown number, but she immediately recognized the tone. "So this is how unemployed teachers climb the ladder now. By seducing rich widowers. It would be a shame if the press found out about your interesting history." Mark. Even after so long, he still had the power to make her heart race with fear. Her hands trembled as she reread the message, painful. Memories flooding her mind, but something was different this time. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by an anger that she had never allowed herself to feel before. With still trembling fingers, she forwarded the message to Samuel, accompanied by a simple text, "We need to talk." His response was immediate. "I'm on my way." They met not at the mansion this time, but at a busy cafe in the city center. Emily was already there when Samuel arrived, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "He won't stop," she said, as soon as Samuel sat down. "Not until he destroys everything I've built, everything we're building." Samuel covered her hands with his on the table, his touch conveying strength and security. What exactly did he mean by interesting history? Emily took a deep breath. It was a secret she had kept for so long, a wound that had never really healed. "Before I met Mark, when I was still in college, I tried." Her voice failed, but she forced the words out. "I tried to kill myself." The grip on Samuel's hands increased slightly, but his face showed no judgment, only deep compassion. "It was a very difficult time," she continued, the words now flowing like a long-dammed river. "My parents had died in an accident the year before. I was completely alone, struggling to maintain my scholarship. Depression came silently, until one day—" She stopped, breathing deeply. "One day I saw no more reason to continue." "But you continued," Samuel said softly. "You survived." "Yes," she nodded, silent tears running down her face. "I was hospitalized for a month. That's where I met Rachel, who at the time was a social worker at the hospital. She helped me rebuild. My life returned to college. And then, when I thought I was finally well—" "You met Mark," Samuel completed, understanding. "He seemed so protective at first, so concerned with my well-being. I only realized too late that he was just collecting information, building a file on my weaknesses that he could use against me whenever he wanted." Samuel was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons completely different from fear. "Emily," he said finally, his voice carrying a certainty she had never heard before, "that you are not your scars. You are your strength in surviving them. And Mark—" He paused, controlling the anger that was beginning to rise in his voice. "Mark is just another ruin that needs to be left behind as we build something new." "But what if he really goes to the press? What if—" "Then we'll face it together," Samuel gently interrupted her. "Like we faced the Foundation's story, like we faced our own fears of loving again. Together." The word "together" echoed in Emily's heart like a promise, like a foundation on which something new and strong could be built. She looked at their intertwined hands on the cafe table, and for the first time since she received Mark's message, felt truly safe. "Besides," Samuel continued, a small smile appearing on his lips, "I think it's time we showed your ex-husband that some stories can't be destroyed by empty threats. Some stories are too strong for that." And it was at that moment, in a busy cafe in downtown Boston, that Emily realized she had finally found not just love, but also her own strength. Strength that didn't come from denying her fractures, but from accepting them as part of who she was, just like the restored stained glass of the Newport Church, which shone even more intensely because of its scars. Tentar novamente. The days that followed brought a series of events that tested Emily's newly discovered strength. Mark's threats didn't stay just in messages. Small notes began to appear in social columns, veiled insinuations about an opportunistic teacher who was taking advantage of a respected businessman's grief. But it was on a rainy Wednesday that the situation really exploded. Emily was in her classroom at school preparing for her next class when the principal called her for an urgent conversation. The woman's grave countenance already indicated that something was wrong. "Emily," the principal began, her discomfort evident. "We've received some concerning emails about your medical history." Emily's heart stopped for a moment. She knew exactly what this was about even before the principal continued. "Apparently, there was a psychiatric hospitalization in your past that wasn't declared when you applied for the position. I understand it's something personal, but considering we work with children—" "Are you firing me?" Emily interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil in her chest. The principal at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "We're placing you on administrative leave for an indefinite period." Emily left the school that afternoon under a torrential downpour, the kind of storm that makes Boston seem like an underwater city. Her tears mingled with the rainwater as she walked aimlessly, until she realized her feet had automatically taken her to the mansion. Samuel was there, as always, but something in his expression when he saw her enter, soaked and trembling, said that he already knew. "Rachel called me," he explained, approaching with a towel he kept in the improvised office for rainy days like this. "She saw the news on the school's website." Emily allowed him to wrap her with the towel, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the anger and frustration that finally overflowed. "He succeeded," she said, her voice choked. "He managed to make me appear exactly as he always said I was: unstable, dangerous, unsuitable." "No," Samuel replied firmly, his hands on her shoulders. "He just proved how small he is, how pathetic in his need for control. It was then that something unexpected happened. A sound began to emerge from Emily's chest, first low, then growing until it became a laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it had something liberating about it. "You know what's most ironic?" she said between laughs and tears. "For the first time in years, I don't feel unstable. I'm angry, yes, I'm hurt, but I don't feel broken." Samuel observed her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "What do you want to do?" The question was simple, but carried enormous weight. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't telling her what to do, how to act, how to feel. He was just asking what she wanted. "I want to fight," she replied, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice, not just for myself, but for all the others he might try to destroy in the future. It was at that moment that an idea began to form in her mind, an idea that had started with Mary Sanders' diaries and now took shape as a much larger project. "The mansion," she said, turning to face the space around her with new eyes. "What if we transformed it not just into a cultural center, but into a shelter? A place where women who are going through abusive situations can find not just refuge, but also resources to rebuild their lives." Samuel watched her attentively, a smile beginning to form on his lips. "Like a restoration center not just for buildings but for lives?" "Exactly," Emily continued, her excitement growing as the idea developed. "We could offer legal support, psychological, professional training courses, use my experience as an educator, your contacts in the business world, and your story as inspiration," Samuel completed softly, "to show that it's possible to rebuild yourself, even when someone tries to demolish you." Emily felt something warm grow in her chest. It wasn't just love for this man who understood her so completely, but love for herself, for her own ability to transform pain into purpose. "But it will be expensive," she pondered, reality beginning to impose itself on the dream. "And with the loss of my job—" "I can finance it," Samuel began, but Emily interrupted him with a gesture. "No, this needs to be more than just your money or my idea. It needs to be something we truly build together." She paused, gathering courage for her next suggestion. "I have an inheritance, my parents' assets that I never touched, that Mark never knew existed. It's not much, but—" "It's a start," Samuel completed, understanding, "and we can seek other partners, create a true support network, not like the New Life Foundation." The rain outside was beginning to diminish, and a stubborn ray of sunlight managed to penetrate through the clouds, creating a rainbow that reflected in the puddles in the mansion's inner courtyard. Emily walked to the window, observing the phenomenon with a smile. "You know what Rachel always tells me," she spoke, her voice lighter now, "that sometimes we need to go through the storm to see the rainbow." Samuel approached from behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist in a protective but not possessive embrace. "And sometimes we need to lose something to find our true calling." That night, after hours discussing plans and possibilities, they made love for the first time. It wasn't at the mansion. That space now had a greater purpose than their personal desires. It was in Emily's apartment, between simple cotton sheets and the distant sound of rain still falling outside. It wasn't a moment of overwhelming passion or unbridled urgency. It was a slow, respectful discovery of two bodies that carried visible and invisible scars. Samuel's hands were gentle, asking permission with each touch, each caress. And Emily, for the first time in her life, didn't feel the need to hide or diminish herself. Afterward, lying with her head on Samuel's chest, listening to the strong and constant beats of his heart, Emily thought about how true love wasn't like in the romance novels she used to read. It wasn't about being saved by a Prince Charming or about completely forgetting the past. It was about finding someone who would help you save yourself, who would understand that your scars are part of who you are, not something to be erased or hidden. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked softly, his fingers tracing delicate patterns on her back. "About how unpredictable life is," she replied, raising her face to look into his eyes. "A few months ago I was convinced I would never be loved again. And now I know that love isn't something someone can take away from you. It's something you choose to give, that you choose to receive. It's a choice we make. Every day, especially when it's difficult. Samuel pulled her closer, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we begin to transform that mansion into a symbol of renewal. And then, she smiled, a smile that reached her eyes in a way that hadn't happened in a long time. Then we face Mark, not with fear or anger, but with the truth. All the truths. The morning brought with it not just a new day, but a new determination. Emily woke before the sun, her body still carrying the sweet memories of the night before, but her mind already focused on the battle ahead. Beside her, Samuel slept deeply, his features relaxed in a way that made him appear younger, more vulnerable. She got up silently and went to the balcony of her small apartment, observing the city that was beginning to awaken. Boston had this gift of seeming new every dawn, as if the night washed away all the sorrows of the previous day. The air was clean after the rain, and the horizon was beginning to be tinged with shades of pink and orange. It was there, as the sun rose over Boston Harbor, that Emily began to write. Not in her diary this time, but on her laptop. Her words flowed like a long dammed river, telling her story, all of it, without omissions or shame. She wrote about the depression in college, about the suicide attempt that was not an act of weakness, but a cry for help from a young woman who had lost everything too early. She wrote about how she met Mark in the hospital support group, how he presented himself as a volunteer lawyer who helped patients with legal issues, how his seemingly genuine interest in her well-being gradually transformed into control and manipulation. She documented each incident of psychological abuse, each veiled threat, each moment when he used her supposed history of instability as a weapon to keep her submissive. She included copies of recent messages, emails sent to the school, notes planted in social columns. When Samuel woke, he found her still typing, her fingers flying over the keyboard with an almost feverish urgency. "What are you doing?" he asked, softly, approaching with 2 cups of freshly brewed coffee. "Writing my story," she replied, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. Not just to expose Mark, but to show others that they're not alone, that surviving is not shameful, it's strength. Samuel read over her shoulder, his face hardening as he absorbed the details she had never fully shared before. When he reached the part about how Mark had manipulated the legal system to isolate her during the divorce, his hands closed into fists. "He needs to be stopped," Samuel said, his voice laden with controlled anger. "Not just for you, but for all the others he may be manipulating through the foundation." "Yes," Emily agreed, saving the document she had spent the morning writing. "But we're not going to do this alone." That same afternoon, they convened a meeting at the mansion. Rachel was the first to arrive, bringing with her a thick folder of documents, similar cases she had documented over the years in her work as a social worker. Then came others. Teresa, a prosecutor who had tried to prosecute Mark years earlier for another harassment case. Sandra, an investigative journalist who had long suspected the activities of the New Life Foundation. And Laura, a former employee of the law firm who had her own stories to tell. "It's not just about revenge," Emily explained to the group gathered in what had once been the mansion's ballroom. "It's about transforming this place into a symbol of real change, a center where women can find not just shelter, but tools to rebuild their lives." "What about Mark?" Teresa asked, her face marked by years of battles in the judicial system. "He's not going to just sit back and watch this happen without reacting." "No," Emily agreed, exchanging a significant look with Samuel. "That's why we need to be prepared. Each of you has a piece of the puzzle. Together we can finally expose not just him, but the entire system that allows men like him to continue abusing their power." The following hours were dedicated to mapping out a strategy. Sandra, the journalist, had contacts in respectable media outlets that could give the proper seriousness to the complaint. Teresa knew the legal paths to ensure that this time the accusations wouldn't simply be archived. Laura had internal documents from the firm that proved a pattern of predatory behavior, but it was Rachel who brought the most important piece of the puzzle. "Remember Claire?" she asked Samuel, taking out a yellowed envelope from her folder. "She wasn't just a music teacher. In the last months of her life, she was gathering evidence about how the New Life Foundation was being used to manipulate divorce cases in favor of powerful clients. Samuel took the envelope with trembling hands. "She never told me." "She wanted to protect you," Rachel explained gently. "She knew you would blame yourself for not having noticed before. But she left this with me to be used when the time was right." Inside the envelope was a series of emails, documents, and testimonies that Claire had secretly collected. It was the final proof they needed, not just of Mark's corruption, but of an entire system that took advantage of vulnerable women. Emily observed Samuel as he read the documents left by his deceased wife, seeing in his face the exact moment when pain transformed into determination. "Claire was always stronger than I imagined," he said finally, looking at Emily with teary eyes. "Just like you." The plan began to take shape. It wouldn't be a sensationalist expose, but a serious and well-documented investigation. Sandra would publish a series of reports, starting with Emily's story and expanding to show the larger pattern of systemic abuse. Teresa would prepare coordinated legal actions on behalf of multiple victims. Laura would provide the internal testimony that would give credibility to the accusations. "And the mansion?" Rachel asked, looking around at the walls that were beginning to show signs of restoration. "When do we start the transformation?" "Immediately," Emily replied, her voice firm. "We're not going to wait for Mark to be exposed to start helping other women. In fact," she smiled, a smile that mixed challenge and hope, "the more he tries to attack us, the more strength we'll give to the project." That night, after everyone had left, Emily and Samuel remained at the mansion. The moonlight entered through the old windows, creating ghostly patterns on the peeling walls. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Samuel asked, his hands finding hers in the semi-darkness. "It's going to be a difficult battle." Emily turned to him, her face illuminated not just by the moonlight, but by an inner determination that seemed to shine through her skin. "You know what I've learned about restoration since I met you?" she asked, her hands squeezing his. "That sometimes the strongest structures are those that were broken and rebuilt with purpose. This place," she gestured to the mansion around them, "won't just be a restored building. It will be a testimony that it's possible to transform pain into strength, fear into courage, ruins into new beginnings." Samuel pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that carried promises of shared battles and future victories. When they separated, both knew there was no going back. Tomorrow would bring its own storm, but they would face it together, building not just a shelter against the rain, but a beacon to guide other people home. Mark's reaction came faster and more violently than any of them had predicted. The morning after the meeting at the mansion, Boston dawned with sensationalist headlines in local tabloids. "Millionaire widower seduced by teacher with psychiatric history." "Bennett family empire threatened by gold digger." "Scandal in Boston high society." Emily was prepared for the personal attacks, but what caught her by surprise was the cruelty with which they mixed Claire's memory into the story. One of the headlines even insinuated that she had died in mysterious circumstances, casting a shadow over Samuel's sacred grief. "He's desperate," Rachel commented, watching Emily read the articles on her phone during a tense breakfast on the sea balcony of her apartment. "He's shooting in all directions, trying to see what sticks." But it was Samuel's reaction that surprised everyone. Instead of retreating or trying to protect his company's reputation, he called a press conference at the mansion itself under renovation. The contrast couldn't have been more significant. He, impeccable in his dark suit, speaking against a backdrop of peeling walls and scaffolding. "My wife, Claire," he began, his voice firm despite the contained emotion, "dedicated the last months of her life documenting a corruption scheme that used a supposed charitable organization to manipulate judicial processes. She couldn't complete her work, but left enough evidence for others to do so." The cameras flashed incessantly as he continued. "Today I announce that Bennett Restorations is not only breaking all ties with the New Life Foundation, but is also converting this historic mansion into a support center for women in vulnerable situations. And yes," he made a significant pause, his eyes finding Emily's in the front row, "this project is being coordinated by Professor Emily Matthews, A woman whose strength and integrity are only surpassed by her ability to transform pain into purpose. The buzz in the improvised press room was immediate. Journalists stood up. Questions were launched simultaneously, but Samuel maintained control, answering each inquiry with a calmness that disarmed attempts at sensationalism. When a more aggressive reporter tried to question Emily's mental history, it was Rachel who took the microphone. As a social worker with 20 years of experience, she declared, her voice carrying the weight of countless similar battles, I can state that seeking psychological help is not a sign of weakness, but of courage. The real question we should be asking is about people who use confidential medical information as a weapon of manipulation and blackmail. The press conference ended with Samuel announcing the creation of an advisory board for the new center, composed of professionals from various areas: social workers, lawyers, psychologists, educators. This is not just an architectural restoration project, he concluded. It's a project of restoring dignity, hope, lives. But the real battle was just beginning. That same night, Emily received a call from an unknown number. Her hand trembled as she answered, but her voice remained steady. You really think you can face me? Mark's voice was different from what she remembered. There was a tremor of barely contained desperation that she had never noticed before. I have connections you can't even imagine, you idiot. I'll destroy you and that pathetic widower. No, Mark, she replied, surprising herself with the calmness in her voice. You're not going to destroy anyone else. You know why? Because you no longer have power over me, not over anyone. You ungrateful bitch, after all I did for you. What did you do for me? Emily interrupted him, years of contained anger finally finding an outlet. You isolated me. You manipulated me. You used my most vulnerable moment as a weapon against me. But you know something? You failed, because each of your attempts to break me only made me stronger. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a bitter laugh. You have 48 hours to give up this farce. After that, don't say I didn't warn you. The yay call ended, leaving Emily trembling, but not from fear. It was pure adrenaline running through her veins, the electrifying sensation of finally confronting her tormentor as an equal. Samuel, who had arrived during the call and heard part of the conversation, approached from behind her, his hands gently landing on her shoulders. Are you okay? He asked, his voice laden with concern and admiration. Emily turned to face him, a determined smile on her lips. I've never been better. He thinks he can still scare me, but he doesn't realize I'm no longer that frightened woman who fled in pajamas at dawn. No, you're not, Samuel agreed, pulling her into a tight embrace. You're the woman who's helping others find their own strength. That night, as the city slept, Emily and Samuel remained awake, preparing for what would come next. Sandra, the journalist, had confirmed that her first report would be published the next morning. A detailed investigation into the manipulation scheme of the new Life Foundation, with testimonies from several victims. He's going to try to discredit each one of them, Emily commented, reviewing the evidence one last time. He'll use the same playbook he used with me. Look for vulnerabilities, medical histories, anything that can be distorted. But this time it's different, Samuel replied, showing her a document that Claire had left. This time we have concrete evidence, payment records, compromising emails, witnesses willing to speak. Emily picked up her now cold coffee cup, observing the dark liquid as if she could see the future in its depths. You know what's ironic? She asked after a moment. For years, I believed him when he said I would never be loved again, that I was too damaged, too broken. And now, she raised her eyes to Samuel. Now I realize that true love isn't about being whole or perfect. It's about finding someone who helps you pick up the pieces and build something even stronger. Samuel approached, taking her face between his hands, with that gentleness that always surprised her. You've taught me more about love and courage in the last few months than I learned in my entire life, he said softly. And tomorrow, when this story breaks, I want the whole world to know that I'm by your side not despite your scars, but because of them. Because they are proof of your strength, your resilience, your ability to survive and grow. The kiss that followed was different from all the others they had shared. There was in it a taste of promise, of shared battle, of a future being built on foundations of truth and courage. When the sun began to rise, tinging the Boston sky with shades of pink and gold, Emily was ready. The fear was still there somewhere inside her, but now it was just a distant whisper, overshadowed by the certainty that some stories need to be told, not just to bring justice, but to show other women that it's possible to survive, rebuild, love again. And as the city awakened to another day, at the mansion under construction, a new sign was being installed. Claire Bennett Center for Restoration and Women's Empowerment, because some stories deserve a new chapter. Sandra's report exploded like a bomb in Boston's social landscape. The first hours after publication were a whirlwind of calls, messages, and notifications. Emily's phone wouldn't stop ringing, journalists wanting confirmations, old acquaintances expressing support, and most importantly, other women beginning to share their own stories. Rachel had prepared an emergency support line, anticipating the avalanche of reports that would come. In less than 24 hours, more than 50 women had made contact, all with similar stories involving the New Life Foundation and Mark's law firm. "It's like we've opened the floodgates of a dam," Teresa commented during an emergency meeting at the mansion. "Each story that comes to light encourages others to speak up." But it was on the third day after publication that the real storm began. Mark, cornered and desperate, decided to play his last card. In an exclusive interview with a local television channel, he appeared alongside his current wife, a young and visibly nervous woman, to tell his side of the story. Emily watched the interview in her apartment with Samuel by her side, their hands intertwined like an anchor to reality. Mark's performance was impressive in its calculated manipulation, tears at the right moments, dramatic pauses, expressions of sincere concern. "I always tried to help her," he was saying, his voice choked with artificial emotion. "Even after discovering her instabilities. But there's a limit to how much we can sacrifice for someone who refuses to accept help." It was when he began to speak about Claire that Samuel tensed beside Emily. Mark was insinuating that there were interesting coincidences in the death of Samuel's first wife, suggesting that perhaps there was more to the story than the public knew. "Turn it off," Emily said firmly, grabbing the remote control. "He's drowning and trying to pull us down with him." But something in the expression of Mark's current wife during the interview had caught her attention. There was a familiar pattern in the way she slightly shrank when he spoke, how her eyes constantly sought approval before each word. "Rachel," Emily immediately called her friend, "I need you to find a way to contact Bethany, Mark's current wife. I have a feeling." They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Bethany appeared at the mansion, her eyes red from crying, carrying a folder full of documents. "He doesn't know I'm here," she said, her voice trembling. "If he finds out—" "You're safe now," Emily assured her, recognizing in Bethany the same fear that had once consumed her. "You can tell us everything." And Bethany did. About how she met Mark when she was an intern at the firm, how he gradually isolated her from her family and friends, how he used his power and influence to keep her under control. But most importantly, she had proof, recordings, emails, documents that showed not just the personal abuse, but the entire corruption scheme of the foundation. "Why are you showing us this now?" Samuel asked gently. Bethany looked at Emily, tears streaming down her face. "Because when I read your story, when I saw how you survived and rebuilt yourself, I realized I can be strong too, that I'm not alone." That moment marked a decisive turning point in the battle. With the evidence provided by Bethany, combined with the documentation left by Claire and the testimonies of other victims, Teresa now had a case solid enough to take not just to civil court, but also to the district attorney's office. Mark's fall was swift and devastating. In less than a week, he went from respected lawyer to the target of multiple investigations. His partners, fearing the scandal, quickly distanced themselves. The New Life Foundation was shut down, its directors summoned to testify. But for Emily, the true victory wasn't in Mark's destruction, but in the transformation she saw happening around her. The mansion, still under construction, had already become a meeting point for women seeking support and guidance. Rachel coordinated a growing team of volunteers, each bringing their own experience and expertise. On a particularly significant afternoon, while supervising the installation of new stained glass in the mansion's old chapel, now transformed into a group therapy room, Emily found something interesting. An old diary hidden between the walls, belonging to one of the daughters of the merchant who built the house. "Listen to this," she said to Samuel, who was helping with the restoration. "Today I realize that the walls of this house hold more than just our secrets. They hold our hopes, our fears, our stories of love and loss. Each crack tells a story of resistance, each repair a story of rebirth." Samuel stopped his work, approaching to read over her shoulder. "It seems this place was always destined to be a refuge for stories of new beginnings," he commented, his arms wrapping around her waist from behind. "You know what else she wrote?" Emily continued, turning. "A few pages. True love is not that which protects us from the world, but that which gives us strength to face it. That allows us to be who we truly are, with all our scars and imperfections." "She was a wise woman," Samuel murmured, placing a soft kiss on Emily's neck. "Yes, she was," Emily agreed, carefully closing the diary. "And now her words will help other women find their own wisdom, their own strength." The afternoon sun entered through the new stained glass, creating colorful patterns on the chapel floor. Each piece of glass had been carefully chosen and positioned, some purposely maintaining small imperfections that, instead of diminishing their beauty, only made them more unique and meaningful. "This is how true love should be," Emily reflected, watching how the light passed through the stained glass. "Like these windows, allowing light to enter through our fractures, transforming our imperfections into art." Samuel turned her in his arms, his eyes meeting hers with that mixture of admiration and love that still made her heart race. "You've transformed not just your own story, but you're helping other women transform theirs." "We transformed," she gently corrected. "You, me, Claire, Rachel, all the women who found courage to speak. Each of us is a stained glass window, broken, restored, stronger and more beautiful because of our stories." The kiss they shared then was like a promise sealed by the colored light that bathed them. A promise that some stories don't need to end in tragedy, that some loves are strong enough to withstand storms, that some scars can become maps guiding other people home. 6 months passed since Mark's downfall, and the Claire Bennett Center for Restoration and Women's Empowerment had become much more than just a renovation project. On a particularly significant morning, Emily was standing in the mansion's inner courtyard, watching a group of women participating in a craft class, part of the professional training program they had implemented. Among them was Bethany, Mark's ex-wife, who, after going through the center's psychological support program, had discovered a natural talent for ceramic art. Her pieces, inspired by architectural patterns of the mansion itself, were beginning to attract attention from local galleries. "Sometimes I wonder if Claire knew," Samuel's voice sounded softly behind Emily, his hands finding her shoulders in a familiar touch. "If she imagined that her last battle would transform into something like this." Emily leaned back against him, watching how the morning light danced through the restored stained glass, creating a kaleidoscope of colors over the working women. "I think she knew. Somehow, she always knew that some stories need to be told so others can be rewritten." The center had become a model of success, attracting attention and support from national and international organizations. But for Emily, the real success was in the small moments, in the hesitant smile of a newcomer, in the gleam of realization in the eyes of someone who finally found her voice, in the strength she saw growing day by day in the women who passed through there. That afternoon, while conducting one of the group sessions that had become her specialty, Emily noticed a new woman at the back of the room. Her eyes carried that look that she knew so well, a mixture of fear and hope, of desire for change and terror of the unknown. "My name is Helen," the woman introduced herself when her turn came, her voice almost a whisper. "And I don't know if I should be here. My husband isn't violent, not like the other cases I've heard. He just makes me doubt everything. Myself, my memories, my perceptions. That's violence too," Emily responded softly, recognizing in Helen's eyes the same gaslighting she had lived through. Sometimes the deepest scars are those that nobody can see. After the session, while organizing her notes, Emily felt a familiar presence at the door of the room. Rachel was there, her face carrying an expression that mixed concern and determination. "We have a problem," she said without preambles. "Mark is trying to come back." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but her voice remained firm when she asked, "What do you mean?" "He's under house arrest awaiting trial," Rachel explained, sitting beside her. "But apparently he managed to strike a deal with the prosecution. He's offering information about other schemes in exchange for a reduced sentence. And she hesitated. He wants to make a public statement about you, about the center." Emily was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. 6 months ago, news like this would have devastated her. Now, however, something different grew in her chest. Not fear, but a quiet determination. "Let him speak," she said finally, surprising Rachel. "In fact, let's do better than that. Let's invite him here." "What?" Rachel looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Emily, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Emily replied, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "He wants a stage. Let's give him one. But it will be on our terms, in our territory." When she shared the idea with Samuel that night, in her apartment now decorated with ceramic pieces made by Bethany and photographs of the mansion in different stages of restoration, he initially reacted with the same concern as Rachel. "You don't need to prove anything to him," Samuel said, his voice tense with protective concern. "You don't need to expose yourself to this." Emily approached him, taking his face between her hands with that gentleness that had become her trademark. "It's not about proving something to him. It's about showing all the Helens out there that men like Mark no longer have power over us, that we can look them in the eyes and no longer see monsters, just small people trying to appear big." Samuel observed her for a long moment, that look that always made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. "You're extraordinary, you know that?" "No," she smiled. "I'm just someone who learned that sometimes we need to face our ghosts, not to exorcise them, but to show others that they're not as scary as they seem." The plan was set in motion. Teresa took care of the legal aspects, ensuring that all protective measures were maintained. Sandra organized press coverage, ensuring that the narrative would be under control. And Rachel prepared the center's residents, explaining the symbolic importance of what was about to happen. On the morning of the event, Emily stood in the mansion's old ballroom, now transformed into an auditorium. The place was packed. Current and former residents of the center, journalists, supporters. Samuel was by her side, as always, his presence a constant source of strength. When Mark entered, escorted by his lawyers, a heavy silence fell over the hall. Emily observed him with an almost clinical curiosity. He seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than in her memories. His eyes, which she once found hypnotizing, now just looked tired and empty. "Welcome to the Claire Bennett Center for Restoration and Women's Empowerment," she said, her voice clear and firm echoing through the hall. "The place where stories of abuse transform into stories of liberation." What followed was one of the most powerful performances that historic mansion had ever witnessed. Mark tried his old script, calculated remorse, manipulated explanations, veiled insinuations, but each attempt to control the narrative was gently but firmly redirected by Emily. "You're not here to defend yourself," she interrupted him at a particularly tense moment. "You're here to witness what happens when women decide to transform pain into power, fear into courage, silence into voice." One by one, women began to stand up in the auditorium. Some were his former clients from the foundation, others were new residents of the center. Each shared her story not with anger or vengeance, but with the dignity of someone who finally found her own voice. Bethany was the last to speak. Her voice, once so hesitant, now carried a quiet strength when she addressed her ex-husband directly. "You taught us to be afraid, but this place taught us to have courage. You tried to break us, but here we learned that some things, when broken and restored with love, become even stronger and more beautiful." When it was all over, When the cameras were turned off and the crowd began to disperse, Emily found Samuel in the mansion's garden. The sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that resembled the stained glass of the chapel. "How are you?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "At peace," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of that word. "It's as if a cycle has closed, not through vengeance or justice, but through transformation." Samuel kissed her forehead softly. "You've transformed this place into much more than a support center. You've transformed it into a symbol that it's possible not just to survive, but to flourish." Emily looked at the mansion, its old walls, now filled with new life and purpose. "You know what's most amazing? Each woman who passes through those doors carries a bit of this transformation with her, like seeds of hope being spread throughout the world." That night, as the city prepared to sleep, the mansion remained illuminated, its windows shining like beacons in the darkness. And inside it, on walls that once witnessed so many stories of love and loss, new stories continued to be written, stories of women who, like the restored stained glass of the chapel, learned that the most beautiful light is that which passes through our fractures and transforms them into art. The first anniversary of the center was approaching, and with it came a wave of reflections and changes. Emily, now nationally recognized for her work with women in vulnerable situations, had been invited to give lectures in several cities across the country. Her story of overcoming and transformation inspired other institutions to follow a model, similar to the Claire Bennett Center. On a particularly significant morning, while organizing preparations for the center's one-year celebration, Emily found something special, an old box containing photographs of the mansion in its original days of glory. Among the images yellowed by time, there was one that particularly caught her attention. It showed a couple dancing in the old ballroom, their faces radiant with happiness. "They're the last owners before the abandonment," Samuel's voice sounded, behind her, his hands finding her shoulders with that comfortable familiarity they had developed. "Anthony and Mary Sanders, the same one from the diaries we found during the restoration." Emily observed the photograph more carefully, noticing the details of the ballroom, the same stained glass that now illuminated her group sessions, the same marble floors where women now rebuilt their lives. "They look so happy," she commented, her fingers gently tracing the contours of the image. "They were," Samuel confirmed, sitting beside her. "I discovered more about their story during the research for the restoration. Mary Sanders was considered a revolutionary. For her time, she insisted on working, even against her family's wishes, and used part of her inheritance to help women in vulnerable situations. So this place always had this calling," Emily smiled, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "It was always a space for transformation and resistance." That's how the theme for the center's one-year celebration was born, dancing between stories. The idea was to transform the old ballroom, now mainly used for workshops and meetings, into a space that honored both its past and its present. The preparations involved the entire center community. Bethany, who had become a respected artist, created a special installation, small mosaics made with ceramic shards, each telling the story of a woman who had passed through the center. The pieces were installed on the walls of the ballroom, creating an effect that resembled a starry sky. Rachel coordinated a special project with the residents. Each wrote her story on small cards that were hung along with old and new photographs of the mansion, creating a timeline that connected past and present. On the night of the celebration, the mansion was unrecognizable. Soft lights illuminated the restored stained glass, creating colorful patterns that danced across the hall. The walls, once marked by deterioration, now told stories of renewal through Bethany's mosaics and the residents' photographs. Emily was nervous as she prepared for her speech. She wore a midnight blue dress, her favorite color, and for the first time in a long time she felt truly beautiful, not just for her appearance, but for the strength that radiated from within. "A year ago," she began, her voice echoing through the packed ballroom, "this place was considered a ruin, just like many of us when we first arrived here. But we learned together that ruins are not the end of the story, they're just the beginning of a new one." Her words were interrupted by emotional applause. At the back of the hall, she could see familiar faces, women who had arrived broken and now radiated confidence, professionals who had donated their time and expertise, supporters who had believed in the project from the beginning. Each restored piece of this mansion represents a transformed life, she continued. Each repaired stained glass, each rebuilt wall, each polished floor tells the story of someone who chose to start over. And today we're not just celebrating 1 year of existence, we're celebrating hundreds of new beginnings. Samuel was in the front row, his eyes shining with pride and love. Beside him, Rachel smiled through tears, and Bethany, now a recognized artist and teacher at the center, held the hand of her new girlfriend, a love story that had blossomed between the restored walls of the mansion. But there's something else I want to share with you today. Emily paused, her heart accelerating slightly. Something I learned during this year, that true love isn't just about finding someone who accepts us as we are, but about finding someone who inspires us to be our best version. Her eyes met Samuel's, and in that moment, the entire ballroom seemed to disappear. Samuel, she continued, her voice softer but still clear, you didn't just help me restore this place, but you taught me that some love stories are like these stained glass windows, more beautiful precisely because of their fractures, stronger for having been carefully reconstituted. Samuel rose slowly, his eyes fixed on hers as she continued. And that's why in this place that has witnessed so many transformations, I want to ask you a question. She paused, taking a deep breath. Do you want to build more stories with me? Not just here at the center, but in all aspects of our lives. The silence that followed was electric. Samuel walked up to her, his hands finding hers with that gentleness that always surprised her. You gave me back the ability to believe in love, he responded, his voice choked with emotion. You showed me that it's possible to honor the past while building a new future. Yes, I want to build all possible stories with you. The kiss they shared was accompanied by applause and tears of joy, but for Emily and Samuel, it was as if they were alone in the world. At that moment, under the colored light of the restored stained glass between walls that had witnessed so many stories of love and overcoming, they were writing another chapter in their own story of restoration. The music began to play, the same waltz that Anthony and Mary Sanders had danced to in that same ballroom decades before. And as Emily and Samuel danced, their bodies moving in perfect synchrony, the walls of the mansion seemed to whisper all the stories they had witnessed, stories of loss and recovery, of falling and rising again, of love that survives and strengthens through adversity. And on the walls, Bethany's mosaics shone like stars, each broken and recomposed piece telling its own story of transformation. Because sometimes the most beautiful things are those that were broken and restored with love, purpose, and hope. The months that followed the engagement brought a new dynamic, not just to Emily and Samuel, but to the entire center. The wedding was being planned to take place right there, in the restored mansion. A decision that emerged naturally, as if the place itself had the right to witness this further transformation in their lives. On one particularly significant afternoon, while supervising the installation of a new wing of the center, a space dedicated specifically for professional training courses, Emily received an unexpected visit. It was Helen, the woman who months earlier had arrived at the center whispering that her husband just made her doubt herself. I need to show you something, Helen said, her eyes shining with a confidence that wasn't there when she arrived. In her hands, she carried a brown envelope. Inside the envelope was a court decision. Her divorce had been finalized, and she had gained not only her freedom, but also the right to use her story to help other women. Helen had become one of the center's main speakers, specializing in identifying and combating gaslighting in abusive relationships. You taught me that some victories don't come with fanfare and confetti, Helen said, her voice firm. Sometimes, the greatest victory is simply regaining confidence in our own perceptions. Emily hugged Helen, feeling in that moment how each story of overcoming that passed through the center was, somehow, a continuation of her own healing journey. I have another reason for being here today, Helen continued after they separated. I want to ask you something special. Would you accept if I made your wedding dress? The proposal caught Emily by surprise. Helen had revealed an extraordinary talent for sewing during her stay at the center, transforming this skill into a thriving micro-business of custom dresses. "It would be an honor," Emily responded, moved, "but with one condition, that it not be traditional white. I want something that represents who we are, our story." Helen's smile widened. "I already had something in mind," she said, taking a drawing from her folder. "Midnight blue, like the dress you wore when you proposed to Samuel, but with gold details that resemble the restored cracks in the mansion's walls. Kintsugi in the form of a dress." Kintsugi, the Japanese art of restoring broken pieces with gold, transforming fractures into part of the object's beauty. It was perfect. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations, but not just for the wedding. The center continued to grow, expanding its programs and reach. Rachel had developed a care protocol that was being adopted by other institutions across the country. Bethany, now coordinator of the art therapy program, was preparing a national exhibition with works created by residents. It was during one of these busy afternoons that Samuel found Emily in the old office of the mansion, now transformed into her workspace. She was absorbed in documents, social impact reports, spreadsheets for new projects, thank you letters from former residents. "I have a surprise for you," he said, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. "Another one?" She smiled, looking up. From the papers, Samuel had become an expert in small surprises, from flowers left in unexpected places to affectionate notes hidden among her documents. "This one is special," he replied, handing her an elegant envelope. "Open it." Inside was a deed. The mansion, which until then officially belonged to Bennett Restorations, was being transferred to an independent foundation, the Claire Bennett Foundation for Women's Empowerment. "But," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly, "the board of directors will be formed entirely by women who have passed through the center," Samuel explained. "You, Rachel, Bethany, Helen, this place will never again depend on a single person or company. It will truly be a space of and for women." The tears came before she could contain them. Tears of gratitude, of love, of fulfillment. "Claire would be proud," she said softly. "She is," Samuel replied, his own eyes watery. "Somehow I'm sure she is." The wedding day dawned with a particular light, the kind that only Boston knows how to create. The mansion was transformed. The walls, which still purposely maintained some of their restored scars, were decorated with arrangements of wildflowers, the same ones that had grown spontaneously in the abandoned garden when Emily visited the place for the first time. The dress created by Helen was a work of art. The deep midnight blue was cut by golden lines that followed patterns similar to the restored cracks in the walls, each telling a part of her story. The center's residents had been involved in the preparation, some making arrangements, others taking care of the music, all contributing with their newly discovered skills. The ceremony took place in the old ballroom, under the light of the restored stained glass. Rachel, as the officiant, conducted a ritual that blended traditional elements with symbols of renewal and transformation. At the moment of the vows, Emily and Samuel chose to speak from the heart, without prepared texts. "When you found me in that library," Emily began, her voice clear and firm, "I believed I would never be loved again, that I was too broken, too damaged. You didn't try to fix me. You showed me that my fractures were part of my strength. You taught me that true love isn't about being perfect, but about being authentic." Samuel squeezed her hands lightly before responding. "You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. Not just the capacity to love, but the courage to build something new. Claire taught me about unconditional love. You taught me about transformative love. And together we transformed not just our lives, but created a space where other people can find their own transformation." The celebration that followed was not just of their love, but of all the stories of overcoming that the center had witnessed. Women who had arrived broken now danced with renewed confidence. Children who had known only fear in their homes now ran freely through the restored corridors. In a quiet moment of the celebration, Emily and Samuel escaped to the second-floor balcony, their favorite place in the mansion. From there they could see the entire city, the lights of Boston shining like earthly stars. "You know what I love most about you?" Samuel asked, his arms embracing her from behind. "What?" "How you transformed your pain into purpose. How each of your scars became a map to guide other people to freedom." Emily turned in his arms, the midnight blue dress shimmering with its golden details. "And you know what I love most about you? How you understand that love isn't about possessing or protecting, but about giving space to grow, to transform, to be." The kiss they shared then was different from all the others. It carried the weight of their individual stories and the lightness of their joint future. It was a kiss that spoke of fulfilled promises and new beginnings, of honored scars and renewed hopes. Below them, the celebration continued. The sound of laughter and music rose to the balcony, mixing with the sea breeze. And on the walls of the mansion, each restored crack, each scar transformed into art, each story of overcoming engraved in its century-old bricks, seemed to whisper a universal truth, that the strongest love is not the one that was never broken, but the one that chooses every day to rebuild itself with even more beauty. Time has a peculiar way of marking its own transformations. 5 years passed since that wedding night in the restored mansion, and the Claire Bennett Center had become much more than a symbol of hope. It was now a national network of support and women's empowerment, with branches in several major cities. On a particular spring morning, Emily was in her office in the original mansion reviewing reports from the new centers, when a soft knock on the door made her look up. It was Sophie, her 3-year-old daughter, precariously balancing while carrying a colorful drawing. "Mommy, look!" the little one exclaimed, running to show her artwork. "I drew our house!" The drawing showed the mansion in childish strokes, but with a surprising perception of the details: the colorful stained glass, the walls with their characteristic marks, and several female figures representing the women who frequented the center. In the center of the drawing, a family: Emily, Samuel, Sophie, and her older sister, Claire, the 4-year-old girl they had adopted 2 years earlier, one of the children who arrived at the center with her mother seeking refuge. "It's beautiful." "My love," Emily smiled, pulling her daughter onto her lap. "You captured the spirit of this place perfectly. Aunt Bethany said I'll be an artist just like her," Sophie proudly declared, referring to her godmother, who now coordinated art therapy programs in all the centers of the network. At that moment, Samuel appeared at the door, carrying Claire on his shoulders. The older girl, with her serious eyes and sweet smile, had inherited her father's love for architecture. She was always drawing floor plans and asking questions about restoration. "Family meeting in the office?" he joked, entering the room. "Or should I say board meeting?" It was an inside joke between them. The girls had developed the habit of participating in the center's meetings, sitting quietly in a corner with their drawings and books, unconsciously absorbing lessons about empathy, strength, and transformation. "Sophie just gave me a work of art," Emily explained, showing the drawing. "Our family and our mission, all on a single page." Samuel put Claire on the floor and approached to see the drawing, his eyes softening with emotion. "It's perfect," he commented, noticing how their daughter had even captured the golden cracks in the walls, the kintsugi marks that had become a symbol of the center. "Daddy," Claire pulled the sleeve of his shirt, her expression serious as, always when she was about to ask an important question, "Why do some people break beautiful things?" The silence that followed the question was heavy with meaning. Emily and Samuel exchanged a look. Claire still carried nebulous memories of her life before the center, fragments of a past that she was gradually beginning to process. "Sometimes, my love," Emily answered softly, extending her arm to include her older daughter in the family embrace. "People break things because they themselves are broken inside. But the important thing isn't why something was broken, but how we choose to rebuild it." "Like the stained glass?" Sophie asked, her eyes shining with the peculiar wisdom of small children. "Exactly like the stained glass," Samuel agreed, picking up both girls, a feat that was becoming more challenging as they grew. When light passes through them, all the cracks become part of the design. At that moment, Rachel appeared at the door, her face lit up with the excitement of good news. Sorry to interrupt the family moment, but we just received confirmation. The bill was approved. The news was the culmination of years of work, specifics, legislation for the protection and support of women in vulnerable situations, directly inspired by the Claire Bennett Center model. The law would ensure public funding for similar centers across the country, as well as establish protocols for care and support. The original Claire would be so proud, Rachel continued, her eyes watery. Both your first wife and our little Claire here. She winked at the girl, who smiled shyly. She is, Samuel said softly, kissing the top of his older daughter's head. Both are. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Emily and Samuel sat on the mansion's balcony, their special place since the early days. The city of Boston stretched before them, its lights mixing with the stars. Sometimes I wonder, Emily said, leaning back against Samuel's chest, if all this would have happened if I hadn't run that night, if I hadn't found the courage to run, barefoot down the street. Sometimes we need to completely break to discover what we're really made of, Samuel replied, his arms gently tightening around her. You didn't just rebuild yourself, you built a beacon to guide other people home. The sound of children's laughter echoed from inside the mansion. Probably the girls still awake, sharing secrets in their rooms. The sound mixed with the voices of women still participating in the evening support group downstairs, creating a symphony of healing and hope. You know what I love most about our story? Emily asked, turning to face her husband. What? That it's not just about us. It's about all the stories that intertwined with ours. Helen finding her voice, Bethany discovering her art, each woman who passed through those doors carrying her own pieces and leaving with a new mosaic. Samuel smiled, that smile that still made her heart skip even after so many years. And about two girls who are growing up knowing that strength doesn't mean never breaking, but knowing how to rebuild. The kiss they shared then carried the flavor of all their stories, the old and the new, the sad and the happy, the broken and the restored. It was a kiss that spoke of a love that had grown not despite the scars, but through them, transforming each mark into a testimony of resistance and renewal. And on the walls of the mansion, between the golden cracks and the restored stained glass, thousands of stories continued to be written. Stories of women who, like Emily, discovered that sometimes you need to lose everything to find your true strength. Stories that proved, day after day, that the truest love is not the one that protects us from breaking, but the one that teaches us to shine through our fractures. The Claire Bennett Center had become more than a project or an institution. It was a living, pulsating movement that spread like waves throughout the country. Each transformation story that left those walls generated dozens of others, creating an infinite network of healing and hope. Later that night, when most of the guests had already left, Emily found a moment of quietude in the old chapel. The restored stained glass shone under the moonlight, creating colorful patterns on the marble floor. It was there that Samuel found her, as he always seemed to find her in the most significant moments of their lives. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, approaching silently. "About how it all began," she replied, her voice soft in the quietness of the space. "About how each decision, each moment of pain and courage brought us here." Samuel embraced her from behind, both observing, through the stained glass, the city that stretched beyond the mansion's walls. Boston slept under a starry sky, its lights mixing with the glow of the stars. "You know what Claire told me once?" he spoke after a moment of contemplative silence. Shortly before she left, she said that sometimes the universe breaks our hearts, not to destroy us, but to open us to something greater than ourselves. Emily turned in his arms, looking into the eyes of the man who had not only restored her faith in love, but had become her partner in a mission much greater than themselves. She was right, Emily smiled, gently touching Samuel's face. Every break in our lives brought us here. Every scar taught us something about healing and transformation. The sound of soft footsteps made them turn. It was their daughters, Claire and Sophie, still wearing the dresses from the celebration. Claire, the older one, carried a small package wrapped in gold paper. "Mom, Dad," she said, her voice carrying that unique mixture of maturity and innocence that was beginning to mark her adolescence. "We made something special for today." Sophie, always more expansive than her sister, could barely contain her excitement. "It's a gift for the center, but actually it's for you too." Carefully, Claire unwrapped the package, revealing a ceramic piece, clearly made under Bethany's guidance. It was a miniature of the mansion, but not as it was now. It was a unique representation that showed the building split in half. One side represented the ruins of the past, the other side showed the restored splendor of the present. "Look closer," Sophie insisted, pointing to the details. In the miniature's small windows, tiny faces had been painted with extraordinary delicacy. Hundreds of them, each representing a story that had passed through the center. And at the top of the small mansion, engraved in gold, were the words, "Because some stories deserve to be rewritten." "It's beautiful," Emily whispered, tears freely running down her face. "It's perfect." "You understood," Samuel added, his voice choked with emotion. "You understood exactly what this place represents." "Of course we understand, Dad," Claire replied with that wisdom that sometimes seemed beyond her years. "We grew up seeing stories being transformed here. We grew up learning that true love isn't about power or control. It's about freedom and reconstruction," Sophie completed, hugging her sister. In that moment, as the family united in a collective embrace in the chapel illuminated by the moon, Emily felt something complete in her heart. The circle that had begun that night of desperate escape had closed, but not in an ending, in a new beginning. The Claire Bennett Center would continue to grow, transforming lives, rewriting stories. Their daughters would carry forward the legacy of transformation and hope. And on the walls of the mansion, between the cracks restored with gold and the stained glass that told stories of rebirth, the message would continue to echo. That the strongest love is not the one that was never broken, but the one that chooses every day to rebuild itself with even more beauty. Because some stories don't need endings, they just need new chapters, written with the golden ink of transformation and hope. And as long as there are women needing to find their strength, as long as there are hearts needing to be restored, the mansion will remain there, its doors open, its walls telling stories of breaking and rebuilding, of pain transformed into purpose, of love that transcends scars and becomes light to guide others on the path to liberation.